So now I'm going to hand over to our speakers and we'll learn a little bit more about inspiration from abroad. So first up, I'm going to invite Olivia to talk about Bolivia.
If anyone can't hear me, we've got a microphone, so I'll use that. Okay, do we have slides?
Yes, they're on there.
So I'm going to talk about challenges to the 21st century socialist project in Bolivia, where I've just returned from 5 months field work for a PhD project. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of what happened in Bolivia, drawing attention to the rise of the far right at state level and in the streets, and the re-emergence of imperialism and racism as dominant forces in Bolivian politics, and some thoughts about the upcoming elections in May. So, in November of last year, a coup took place in Bolivia. Former President Evo Morales was forced to resign at the behest of the military, following a police mutiny in cities across the country. This was the culmination of 2 weeks of mobilization by anti-government protesters who accused the government of fraud in the elections on October 20th. The accusations of fraud started in earnest when the rapid count system, this is a bit technical, but the rapid count system known as the Transmission of Preliminary Electoral Results, the TREP, ceased counting at 83% of the total vote. The TREP is used by the Electoral Authority to publicise the proximate vote count ahead of the official result. The opposition, the Organisation of American States, corporate media were quick to declare foul play when it stopped counting. And this unleashed a wave of violence across the country, which, as it unfolded, was increasingly steered by ultra-right business leader Luis Fernando Camacho, the head of the regional group, the Pro Santa Cruz Committee, and he also has ties to fascist youth groups. The military's abandonment of the mass government, the movement towards socialism, proved the breaking point that forced Morales to leave. In his resignation speech, Morales emphasized that he was leaving to pacify the country. "I don't want to see any more mistreated families," he said, condemning attacks against people in his party, including his own sister, whose house was burned down. He described what had happened as a civic political police coup. "Being an Indian and being a left-wing anti-imperialist is my sin," he said. In the gaping power vacuum which ensued, a new interim president manoeuvred herself into position. Bible-carrying conservative opposition leader Janine Áñez, who represents a party that received just 4% of the vote in the elections. Áñez was next in line for the presidency after Morales' vice president, Álvaro García Linera, and the head of both chambers of Congress resigned in the face of threats of violence against top mass officials unless they left office. Anti-mass protesters burned the houses of several ministers, and at local level also trade union officials. The new interim government immediately launched a brutal crackdown on protesters and mass supporters. At least 30 civilians were killed and 700 injured by police-military forces as they protested against the coup. In Sacaba, in the Chapare region, which is home to the coca growers, peaceful protesters were shot in the back from a police helicopter. So, what is the background to this? Morales was the first indigenous president in Bolivia, a country with a 500-year history of racism and colonial violence. Over Morales' 14-year tenure, income inequality went down by 2/3, extreme poverty dropped from 38% to 17%, and Bolivia enjoyed steady economic growth while nationalising key industries and hydrocarbons, and rejecting IMF debt bondage. New infrastructure projects, social welfare and healthcare provision transformed the lives of poor people, women and indigenous peoples in Latin America's poorest country. Significantly, these protests that led to the downfall of Morales involved an emergent middle class whose fortunes had significantly improved under Morales' government. The coup can be understood, therefore, as a backlash to Morales' redistributive economic policies and his anti-imperialist political vision. But it must also be understood as being enabled through failings in the masses' internal politics, notably the failure to find successors, for example. So, in terms of what the interim government has done so far, despite being a transitional regime, the government has already enacted sweeping changes which far exceed its mandate. It has re-established diplomatic ties with the USA and Israel, while suspending relations with longtime ally Cuba. Hundreds of foreign citizens have been expelled, including over 700 Cuban doctors and Venezuelan diplomats. Arrest warrants have been issued against dozens of mass politicians and former government employees, many of whom are in hiding. Armed police now flank the Mexican embassy, where 7 ex-ministers, an ex-governor, and numerous ex-officials are seeking asylum. Freedom of the press has largely vanished under a sustained assault by the de facto government. Rural radio stations have been shut down and their staff harassed. On New Year's Eve, journalists Alejandro Salinas, Orestes Sotomayor, and Yesmi Marquez were detained and accused of inciting terrorism and sedition for criticising the government on blogs and social media. The government is assisted in the streets by paramilitary activism masquerading as civic resistance. In rural areas, there have been violent attacks by gangs against mass-supporting trade unionists. A fortnight ago, Felix Coche Flores, ex-leader of the La Asunta Federación, was viciously beaten by government supporters during a union meeting in the Yungas region. Ex-Minister Carlos Romero was hospitalized for stress and dehydration after groups of far-right civilians prevented food and water from entering his home in La Paz. The coup has also seen the resurgence of racial hatred, as political and institutional conflicts converge with deep-rooted ethno-racial tensions. Indigenous peoples make up the majority of Bolivia's population, but have historically been excluded from power and exploited by elites. Following independence from Spain in 1825, Bolivia has been ruled largely by wealthy, white or mixed-race descendants of Spanish colonizers. Later in the 20th century, Bolivia was governed by a succession of unstable military dictatorships. Following the election in October, graffiti was daubed outside the UMSA University, that's the main public university in La Paz, demanding Indians out of UMSA. According to social media posts, "Long live Bolivia free from Indians" was chalked on roads by anti-mass blockaders. Incidents such as these have deep historical significance in Bolivia, where indigenous peoples until the late 20th century experienced harassment and exclusion for wearing indigenous dress, for appearing to be indigenous, especially in urban centres. Executive Secretary of the Mining Union, the Union Federation of Mine Workers, and supporter of the mass, Orlando Gutierrez, said in November, before Morales was ousted, "These cankers, whites, do not accept that a comrade, a peasant leader, Evo Morales, assumed power of the country and has taught them to govern." Immediately after Morales' resignation, anti-mass protesters were filmed burning the Wapala, the flag that represents Andean indigenous peoples. Footage also circulated of police in the city of Santa Cruz, which is the historic hotbed of anti-mass sentiment, ripping off the Wapala from their uniforms. The Wapala is a powerful symbol of resistance to centuries of exploitation, racial violence and social exclusion experienced by indigenous peoples of Bolivia. As Aymara writer Jesus Oscuri writes, "The burning of the Wapala, combined with the ousting of Morales, made many feel as if the Indian was being expelled from power." Imperialism. This coup, I think, is imperialist, but not in the sense that the US is the single active agent seeking to re-establish a presence in the region. Rather, it is homegrown elites and the bourgeoisie who desperately seek the intervention of the USA, who proactively seek closer ties with the USA because they lack the capacity to challenge the power of social movements and the left through conventional politics. At the behest of the de facto government, USAID and the Organization of American States will be on hand to help administer the new elections, which are scheduled for May this year. Morales expelled USAID back in 2013, pointing out that it is an instrument of US soft influence in the country. These elites are also angling for the return of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, even at the expense of national sovereignty, in part so they can clamp down on cocoa growers' unions and investigate Evo Morales for spurious charges of corruption. This week, a politician in the same party as Áñez, the new president, called for the DEA to initiate an international investigation against Evo Morales personally for drug trafficking. The USA, I'm sure would be only too happy to oblige, but I think it's important really to note that the momentum for US involvement is coming from elites within Bolivia itself. This is the character of imperialism in Bolivia today. So, in terms of the MAS, the movement towards socialism, Morales' party, I think the MAS at this point needs to embrace a spirit of reflection and self-criticism, which has been absent in many years. It's undeniable that Morales' decision to defy a 2016 referendum in which the public voted against him running for a fourth term, which was then prohibited under the Bolivian constitution, this generated deep popular discontent. And there has been a long tradition of criticism of Morales from the left, which we shouldn't forget. Without doubt, I think this is also a crisis within the internal dynamics and the internal democracy of the MAS party, which has contributed to this situation. But in spite of the attacks by the de facto government, the MAS has shown great resilience and has embarked on a process of democratic renewal. The MAS was and is a party that is most tightly linked with peasant organisations in the highlands and valleys. Across the country, there have been huge meetings to select new electoral candidates. Given that many have faced intimidation, harassment and imprisonment, this is very encouraging. I think the crisis has forced the MAS to be responsive to its base in a way that it hasn't had to for a long time. A lot of people from the left pointed out that Morales, in the good times, when he was a very popular leader, surrounded himself with ministers who actually came from traditional sources of power, the urban middle classes, non-indigenous sectors. In the crisis, he suddenly had to draw on traditional allies, and some stuck by him, such as the Peasants' Union, the Sasutsabe, and some did not, like the leadership of the major trade union, the COP. So there are upcoming elections. New elections are scheduled for the 3rd of May. However, it is looking doubtful that the interim government will actually allow these to be genuinely free and fair. This week, another MAS politician, Gustavo Torrico, was apprehended for sedition and terrorism. Last week, a judge ordered a 6-month preventative jail for Evo Morales' lawyer, Patricia Morsa, who is also pregnant, for carrying the president's documents that were needed to register him as a candidate for the, not for presidency, he's barred from that, but for a seat in the Legislative Assembly. So she's also accused of sedition and terrorism. The saving grace really is that the candidates on the right are very disunited. So to give a bit of background about who's running, so we've got Carlos Mesa. He is a veteran politician. He ran in 2019. All on the neoliberal right-wing ticket. Áñez, the current president, who's running, despite having vowed not to back in November. We've also got, and I think the front runner actually is Luis Fernando Camacho, the mastermind of the coup, who is linked to these far-right groups. He's hoping to bridge the historic East-West divide in an alliance with Marco Kumari, but all signs so far indicate his appeal beyond the elites in Santa Cruz, the city of Santa Cruz, is minimal. On a recent visit to a market in La Paz, he was met with furious chants of murder and pelted with rubbish. Other conservative candidates include, again, another ex-president, Tuto Quiroga, Chi. Chi is a wealthy evangelical Christian pastor who surprised many by scooping 8% of the vote in the October election. Despite pleas by all candidates for unity, none can actually bring themselves to eschew ambitions of power and withdraw to avoid splitting the vote, the anti-MAS vote. So for the MAS, after several weeks selecting candidates, the MAS has opted for presidential candidates in the form of Luis Arce Catacora, an economist and ex-economy minister and architect of prosperity and nationalization under Morales. He's joined by David Choquehuanca, the ex-leader of ALBA, the Latin American trade group, for vice president. He's the ex-foreign minister and an Aymara activist, and is a leading figure in the more indigenous wing of the MAS. So Arce and Choquehuanca are clearly a safe pair of hands. The veteran politicians have been touted by the mass as a winning combination of urban and rural indigenous sectors. Morales has described the two as a combination of scientific knowledge and ancient millenary knowledge. The decision to opt for Arce, who is credited with overseeing the strong growth of the past 14 years, is a pragmatic move, but it has opened up fault lines of conflict within the mass base. As an intellectual, Arce has described himself as a representative of the middle class, and the mass has been accused by some of capitulating to urban middle class interests, especially by overlooking Andrónico Rodriguez, the vice president of the Six Federations, the Cocoa Growers Union, who was surprisingly the favoured candidate of the powerful cocoa growers of the Chapare. This highly independent tropical region is a stronghold of mass support and is home to this large sector of cocoderos. It was also where Morales began his political career as a cocoa growers union leader. Young and charismatic, but highly reminiscent of Morales himself, the mass evidently felt uneasy about placing Rodriguez on the ticket at a time when Morales remains a polarising figure. In recent weeks, government rhetoric demonising cocoa growers as being terrorists, narco-traffickers has intensified. At the end of last year, the government suggested it might send in the military to this region, which is totally independent. I don't think it even has a police presence. So that would, yeah. And to exclude its residents from voting in the elections. Unless the mass are victorious, the future of this cocoa-growing mass heartland looks very uncertain. So, to conclude, the coup in Bolivia is, of course, deeply worrying for the left in Latin America. Morales is one of the last remaining leaders of the pink tide in power. As Latin America's poorest country, with a long history of social struggle and highly organised indigenous and non-indigenous sectors, Bolivia has great revolutionary potential. This coup places the state back into the hands of light-skinned capitalist elites whose power Morales had eroded while in office. Through the criminalisation of dissent and the persecution of Marxist politicians and trade union officials, the capacity of the left to fight, both at the ballot box and the grassroots, is weakened. Freedom of expression, the ability to organise, is deeply imperilled in Bolivia. But there are hopeful signs for the mass. Polls give the mass a clear lead at the moment, but not sufficient to avoid a runoff in the election. Bolivia is extremely polarised, and with a massively emboldened far right, even if the mass secure an electoral victory, it seems unlikely that the violence and harassment at local level will cease. But it's also important to remember that socialism and democracy in Bolivia, the latter understood as a concept that has a broader meaning than in the Western tradition, go beyond the mass. It's tied up in grassroots unions that sustain the party, and it's to these movements that we must look as the way forward.
So I am just going to take, if anyone has any direct questions to each of the speakers, just after they've finished, very quickly, if we limit these to maybe 1 minute per question, just so that we're not just listening to a wall of 3 different speakers, one after the other. So are there any questions from the audience to Olivia? I'll take Luke and then
You don't know my name. Did the COB Union Federation decide not to fight against the coup because they thought that Mass had cheated in the elections, or because they're too tied in with right-wing forces, or too corrupt, or?
Yeah, I don't think they're tied in with right-wing forces. This was at the point when, so on the Sunday Morales resigned, and up till then he had sort of maintained the support of these key social sectors. And then suddenly the leadership of the COB came out and said, it's time to resign. And I think this might have been, I think we underplay how much criticism Morales did receive from these sectors, from the trade union movement. And I think it had kind of reached a point where the country was it was totally at an impasse. And I think the COB leadership, they came out and said resign. But I don't think they're in the pockets. They've been very active about condemning the coup, condemning the government at the moment. So I think they still, you can still look to them. But it was at this point, it was reaching a total kind of an impasse. And I think that's why they came out and said resign. There's probably other dynamics at play. I'm not aware.
And Colin?
I just wanted to ask a bit more about the politics of Mas, and that, because from what you're saying, I got the impression that on the one hand they were introducing reforms through the state structures, and those have been genuine reforms and significant reforms, and that at least they had opened up a space for workers' self-organisation and the self-organisation from below. But it also feels like there's there's the long-standing contrast that's made on the left between reform and revolution, and it feels like they're trying to have a foot in both camps, maybe, or is it? I don't know. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question. I mean, I think the party is the movement towards socialism. I think this was an attempt to capture the state and to achieve, sort of incremental reforms that would benefit the poorest people and the working class. But I think there is a wing in there that does have a sort of the eyes at a more kind of revolutionary transformation of the state and of a more revolutionary understanding of power. But this is it's actually really, I think, sort of social democratic party. It's not a hugely sort of, I don't think its ambitions are hugely revolutionary. I don't know.
Are there any more questions before we move on?
I guess just a general one is the notes you were reading from. Could we have access to them to read them again? Because I'd like to almost read that 3 times and sort of consolidate it in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of. I would recommend you also follow as a journalist at the moment, Olivia Arigho-Stiles in Chipari. It's so there's virtually no press presence, even from Bolivian. Certainly not Bolivian national press, so I would recommend you follow him and he's doing stuff for Mint Press, I think it's Malta as well. But yes, I can share the notes.
How do you spell his name?
Just Oliver Vargas.
Oh, Vargas.
Yeah.
Okay.